They believed they understood every American tank on the battlefield. The silhouette of the Sherman had become a familiar sight, its rounded turret, high chassis, and slow traverse. To German crews in Panthers and Tigers, it was a predictable enemy. Brave, but doomed, the Sherman was what they expected to see burn. For 2 years, it had played that role without surprise. Yet, in the final months of 1944, something began to change. Quietly, invisibly, within the blackened barrels of Allied guns. It started with reports no one in the Wehrmacht took seriously. A Panther in Belgium struck from an unexpected distance. A Tiger in Lorraine, its lower glacis pierced as if by an invisible hand. Intelligence officers marked the cases as anomalies, field errors, or lucky shots. The Sherman was not supposed to do that, but each week, new after-action notes appeared. Unknown ammunition type, increased muzzle velocity, penetration beyond known range. The tone of these reports shifted from irritation to confusion, and then to something like unease. Months earlier, deep within American depots and testing grounds, engineers had confronted a growing panic. The 75mm Shermans could no longer hold their own. Encounters in Normandy had proven catastrophic. German 88s cut through Allied columns before the Shermans could even find range. For every destroyed Panther, there were dozens of American wrecks smoldering on French roadsides. The soldiers called it the slaughter phase. It was not sustainable. Something had to change. At Aberdeen and Fort Knox, small teams of ordnance specialists worked in secrecy. They studied captured German rounds, measured propellant pressures, recorded muzzle velocities, and filled notebooks with equations. They understood that the Sherman's gun did not need to grow, it needed to strike faster. In June 1944, prototypes of a new round appeared on the firing line. It looked ordinary, but inside, it carried a tungsten carbide heart. When fired, it screamed through the barrel at speeds German engineers had once deemed impossible for American steel. It was a new kind of weapon, one that turned kinetic energy into a scalpel. The code name was HVAP, high-velocity armor piercing. Few soldiers even knew it existed. The production rate was low, tungsten was scarce, hoarded for machine tools and cutting blades. But the first boxes were quietly distributed to armored divisions preparing for the push toward Germany. They came with no ceremony, no propaganda, no warnings to the enemy, only a label. M93, for emergency use only. By the time autumn came, the Germans were noticing patterns. Shermans that once failed to penetrate were suddenly killing from 1,000 yards. Some rounds passed clean through a Panther's frontal armor and out the rear plate, leaving the crew with no chance to escape. Intelligence intercepts from the front described new American tungsten-cored projectiles. But to many in Berlin, it sounded like another myth, like the phantom weapons Allied propaganda often invented to mask numerical inferiority. In the Ardennes, under the gray December skies, the myth was about to become real. For German tankers who had spent years watching American shells bounce off their armor, the moment of impact was shocking. The sound was wrong, sharper, higher, metallic. The plate didn't dent, it cracked. Flames erupted before the gunner understood what had happened. Radio operators reported Shermans firing from positions they once ignored as harmless. Gun duels that should have been one-sided were ending in mutual destruction, or worse, in sudden, inexplicable defeat. For the first time, the German crews began to wonder if the Shermans had changed, or if the Americans had learned something they weren't supposed to. The idea that the Americans could outpace German metallurgy had always seemed absurd. Since 1942, the Reich had trusted in its advantage of precision, armor thickness, and range. The Tiger's gun could tear through any Allied tank before the enemy even came within striking distance. Every training manual and field briefing reinforced that belief. When the Americans landed in Normandy, the Wehrmacht's armored divisions expected another campaign of dominance. For months, they were correct. The beaches burned with shattered Shermans. The names of towns, Saint-Lô, Villers-Bocage, became synonyms for Allied failure. Yet even in that chaos, the seeds of change were forming. At American Ordnance Headquarters, engineers dissected the problem like surgeons. They studied photographs of penetrations, cataloged every angle and ricochet. They compared the British 17-pounder, the Soviet 85, the German 88. They discovered the fundamental limitation wasn't the Sherman's armor or even its gun, but its ammunition. The 75mm rounds bled energy too quickly. Their steel penetrators mushroomed upon impact, losing velocity. In early 1944, a proposal reached Washington, a high-density subcaliber core, tungsten carbide, encased within a lightweight aluminum shell. The design was unconventional, almost desperate. The heavy core would carry momentum, while the lighter casing allowed extreme velocity. On paper, it seemed impossible to manufacture at scale. Tungsten was rare, and every pound was already rationed for machine tools needed by aircraft factories. Still, the Army Ordnance Department approved limited trials. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground, technicians loaded the first prototypes into modified 76mm guns. Observers gathered behind sandbagged walls as the command echoed across the range. Fire! The recoil thundered. The projectile punched through a 4-inch armor plate as if it were paper. The steel target behind it crumpled, glowing at the edges. The engineers stood in silence. The calculations were correct. The velocity had exceeded 3,400 feet per second, nearly 30% faster than any previous American round. The M93 HVAP was born. But it remained a secret. The first production batches were counted not in thousands, but in dozens. Each round cost more than an infantryman's rifle. Supply officers were instructed to issue them only under critical conditions. Even frontline commanders often didn't know they had HVAP in their inventory. Crates arrived marked as standard ammunition, indistinguishable from the rest. In the field, tank crews began noticing subtle differences. A few rounds bore a blue-tipped casing and a heavier feel. The armor-piercing cap seemed thinner. The cartridge gleamed with a faint metallic sheen. They loaded them out of curiosity. The results were immediate. In Lorraine, a Sherman gunner named Edward Donnelly fired one at a Panther that had pinned his platoon for hours. The shot struck the lower glacis and burst through cleanly. The crew inside never even returned fire. Donnelly wrote later, "It was like lightning. One flash and it was gone." Word began to spread quietly. "Blue tips kill cats," soldiers joked. Cats meaning panthers and tigers. Yet the Ordnance Corps insisted there was no official confirmation. The secrecy was deliberate. The Americans didn't want the Germans to know why their tanks were suddenly vulnerable. Meanwhile, German field inspectors examined wrecks and fragments of ammunition. They found shards of strange metal embedded in armor plates, metal harder than anything they'd encountered. Laboratories in Essen tested the samples, confirming tungsten traces. But the implications were alarming. Germany's tungsten reserves were dwindling, the result of Allied blockades and the loss of Iberian imports. They could not afford to match this development. In the following weeks, Panther crews received new directives. Avoid frontal engagements when possible. Assume that the enemy's penetration capability has increased. To many, the orders seemed paranoid. Then came December. The counteroffensive in the Ardennes was meant to be Germany's last surprise. But as snow fell over the forests, it was the Americans who carried a hidden weapon. Inside the long barrels of their 76mm Shermans, the future of tank warfare was waiting to be fired. They first noticed it near the town of Hürtgen, long before anyone in Berlin took it seriously. A platoon of Panthers from the 116th Panzer Division reported being struck from the front by Shermans at nearly 1,000 meters. 2 vehicles were destroyed. The survivors insisted it couldn't have been the same American guns they'd faced all summer. The impact holes were too clean, too narrow, without the jagged deformation typical of ricochets. The steel around the penetration points was discolored, molten at the toe. Edges. The regimental armor technician filed the report with a short note. Unidentified high-speed projectile. At first, no one believed them. German command had grown accustomed to exaggerated frontline claims, panicked crews, confusion under fire, or Allied airstrikes mistaken for tank rounds. But as more incidents accumulated across the Western Front, the descriptions aligned. Penetrations at 800, 900, even 100 meters. Each time, the same phrase appeared in the logbooks. New American ammunition type suspected. Intelligence officers gathered at Spa to review the evidence. On the table lay fragments of shattered tungsten, dull gray and impossibly hard. Chemical tests confirmed it: tungsten carbide, the same material used in industrial cutting tools. For the first time, the Germans realized the Americans were fielding something comparable to their own rare Hartkern rounds, but in numbers sufficient to alter the balance. In the quiet halls of the Panzertruppenschule in Fallingbostel, instructors revised the training manuals. They warned that certain Sherman units might possess improved ammunition. They urged crews to engage from maximum range and avoid exposing frontal armor unnecessarily. Yet to many veterans, the warnings seemed absurd. The Panthers' glacis was 80 millimeters thick and sloped. It had never been breached by an American shell. The idea that a Sherman, still viewed as a lumbering mass-produced toy, could do it felt like superstition. On the Allied side, few knew what was happening in the enemy's command posts. Crews only knew that something had changed in their favor. In the Ardennes, as snow turned the landscape into a pale labyrinth, tankers loaded their blue-tipped rounds with silent hope. They didn't expect miracles, only survival. At dawn, a Sherman from the 3rd Armored Division took position overlooking a frozen valley. Through his sight, the gunner saw the unmistakable shape of a panther creeping forward. He waited, heart hammering, as the distance closed to 900 yards. In previous months, that range had meant certain death. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger. The gun roared. A bright flash leapt from the barrel, and in the distance, a black plume erupted from the panther's turret. The round had passed straight through. Radio chatter filled the net. Target destroyed, front hit, repeat, front hit. No one believed it at first. But as more duels followed, the pattern held. Panthers were dying faster than before, often from frontal shots. Crews began counting their remaining HVAP rounds with almost reverent caution. Each one felt like an ace in a losing hand. German reports from December 18th described alarming penetration capability of enemy tanks. The tone of the language had changed, measured, analytical, no longer dismissive. For the first time since 1942, German tank commanders spoke of parity. Some whispered of something worse. As the counteroffensive faltered and the snowfields filled with burning steel, reconnaissance units recovered spent Allied shells and sent them to testing centers in Kummersdorf. Analysts compared the mass and density, confirming their fears. The Americans had harnessed velocity itself as a weapon. It was a shift that could not be undone. Armor could be thickened, but not indefinitely. Range could be increased, but visibility and terrain imposed limits. The physics had changed. The enemy had discovered how to make speed lethal. From then on, every Panther crew entering combat faced a new kind of uncertainty. No longer could they rely on the comfort of invincibility. Each approaching Sherman might be the old enemy, or the new one, and they wouldn't know which until it fired. By late December 1944, German intelligence officers were no longer debating whether something had changed. They were trying to understand how. Reports from the Ardennes and Saar regions poured in daily, all repeating the same improbable details: frontal penetrations at medium range, catastrophic turret explosions, tanks lost to direct fire from Shermans that had previously posed no danger. The command at OKH issued an urgent directive to investigate the presence of a novel kinetic projectile among U.S. forces. At Kummersdorf, fragments recovered from battlefields were laid out on long steel tables beneath harsh lights. Metallurgists measured, weighed, and cut through the remains. The results were clear. The projectile's core was not ordinary steel. It was tungsten carbide, dense and almost unbreakable. Under magnification, its grain structure revealed precision manufacture. One engineer remarked bitterly, "They have achieved what our factories can no longer afford." Tungsten, the metal of precision, the backbone of Germany's industrial war machine. By 1944, it had become as rare as gold. The last major shipments from Portugal had dwindled under Allied diplomatic pressure. Mines in Austria could no longer meet demand. The remaining reserves were guarded for critical cutting tools, needed to machine the hardened steel for aircraft engines and gun barrels. The prospect of using it for mass ammunition production was unthinkable. Now, it seemed the Americans had done exactly that. Field manuals were hastily updated. Crews were instructed to camouflage more thoroughly, to avoid exposing their tanks to long-range duels, and to rely on ambush tactics rather than frontal attacks. But it was a psychological blow that training could not undo. For 2 years, the Panthers' reputation had been its own armor. Its crews believed themselves untouchable from the front. That faith had been cracked open by tungsten and velocity. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the secret was spreading, carefully but decisively. The American Ordnance Network had proven the concept, and now they wanted to scale it. Production orders went out to Bethlehem Steel, Remington Arms, and smaller subcontractors whose machine shops could handle tungsten sintering. The challenge was not technology, it was scarcity. The United States possessed only limited tungsten reserves, much of it imported from China and Burma. To stretch supplies, engineers redesigned the projectile casing to minimize core size without sacrificing velocity. Every gram counted. Inside ammunition plants, the work was delicate. Tungsten dust mixed with cobalt binder, compressed under immense pressure, and fired in furnaces that glowed like miniature suns. The result? A gray cylinder dense enough to sink in mercury, fitted inside a lightweight aluminum sabot. When fired, the sabot peeled away mid-flight, leaving the tungsten dart to travel unimpeded toward its target. Few soldiers ever saw the process. They only knew the result, a round that seemed almost supernatural in its performance. At the front, HVAP shipments arrived in small wooden crates stamped M93. Each crate contained 25 rounds. Commanders guarded them jealously, distributing only a few per tank. Crews marked them with chalk crosses or painted the tips for quick recognition. They called them lifesavers. One after-action report from the 4th Armored Division described an engagement near Bastogne. 3 enemy Panthers destroyed with frontal hits at 900 yards, penetrations complete, no deflection observed. Attached to the report was a note scrawled by the battalion commander. Recommend immediate priority for this ammunition. It changes everything. Back in Germany, tank workshops struggled to compensate. Some attempted to weld additional armor plates onto the glacis, creating crude composite fronts. Others experimented with sandbags or spare track links. Nothing helped. The new rounds ignored improvisation. By early January 1945, even Hitler had been briefed. The Führer's conferences record his disbelief. The Sherman? Penetrating a Panther frontally? Impossible unless the reports are exaggerated. His generals remained silent. They had seen the photographs. From that moment on, the tone of the war shifted, subtly but unmistakably. The German army no longer regarded the Sherman as prey. They approached every battlefield with new caution, unsure which enemy tanks carried the weapon that could kill them from the front. The myth of the invincible German armor was dying, and it was dying fast. The first sign of panic was not in the official reports, it was in the radio chatter. German tank crews began speaking with a new uncertainty. Phrases like schneller Beschuss, faster fire, appeared in transcripts. Gunners whispered about shells that sliced instead of struck. Commanders urged caution where once they had boasted of superiority. The confidence that had defined German armor since 1940 was eroding one engagement at a time. In the forests of the Ardennes, the snow muffled everything except the thunder of engines and the echo of guns. Panther crews, accustomed to watching American shells bounce harmlessly off their fronts, now flinched at every flash from a Sherman barrel. When the familiar dull clang of a deflection was replaced by a sharp metallic crack, they knew something was different and deadly. At night, they spoke in disbelief around their stoves. "How can they pierce us now?" one loader wrote in his diary. "The same tanks, the same guns, but the shots move like lightning." Another noted, "When it hits, the armor doesn't resist, it tears." To them, it was as if the Americans had found a new element of war, something invisible, untraceable, beyond steel itself. American crews noticed the change in enemy behavior. Panthers that once advanced confidently now hesitated behind ridgelines. Tigers that used to dominate the open fields withdrew after exchanging only a few rounds. For the first time, Sherman gunners felt a reversal of fear. They could fire first and see results. Their morale rose quietly, like a tide no one spoke about, but everyone felt. Yet even in victory, few understood what they were wielding. Many believed it was a new gun entirely. Some thought their tanks had been secretly upgraded. Only the ordnance officers knew the truth, that the power came not from the Sherman itself, but from a handful of heavy blue-tipped rounds carried inside its hull. Reports from the front began to carry a new tone. Instead of, "Our shells failed to penetrate," they read, "Enemy vehicle destroyed." In the margins of one report, an officer had scrawled, "Finally, we can fight them as equals." For German intelligence analysts, the psychological shift was unmistakable. They intercepted Allied radio transmissions describing unusual penetration distances and noted the growing aggression in American tank tactics. In January 1945, they concluded that the Americans had acquired or developed high-velocity projectiles capable of defeating standard Panther armor. A single sentence in the report summarized the dread behind the data. "The enemy's learning curve is faster than our production rate." In Berlin, the realization spread through the design bureaus and research institutes. Engineers proposed emergency solutions, thicker armor plates, new alloys, alternative turret angles, but the factories were already exhausted, bombed, short of materials. Even if they could redesign the Panther or Tiger, it was too late. The war had become a race against physics, and Germany had lost that race the moment tungsten became scarce. American tankers, unaware of their enemy's desperation, continued forward through villages reduced to ash. Each duel that ended in their favor reinforced a growing myth among them. The Sherman, once derided as the Ronson-lighter, could now kill anything it faced. The soldiers didn't know the science, they only saw the results. In captured diaries, German officers described the new terror in blunt terms. "We can no longer trust our armor," wrote one from the 2nd Panzer Regiment. "They strike faster than we can think. The first shot decides, and now it is theirs." As the snow melted into the mud of February, both sides sensed the psychological tide turning. American columns pushed deeper into Germany with renewed purpose, their confidence hardening with each engagement. The Germans, once the masters of mechanized warfare, were beginning to feel hunted. They had built their empire on the idea of mechanical perfection, of armor that no enemy could pierce. Now, they were watching that belief disintegrate with every tungsten dart that screamed through the air. To understand why those blue-tipped shells changed everything, one must understand what they were made to do. The standard armor-piercing round relied on brute force, a heavy steel slug driven fast enough to crack armor through sheer momentum. Against vertical plates, it worked. But by 1944, German tanks no longer presented vertical plates. The Panthers' glacis was sloped at 55 degrees, turning the laws of impact into its own defense. A slower projectile, no matter how heavy, would glance off like rain on glass. The American engineers who developed the HVAP had studied that geometry. They realized the answer wasn't to make the shell larger, but faster. In tank warfare, velocity is power squared. A small increase in speed multiplies energy dramatically. The tungsten core, dense and unyielding, could absorb the shock of acceleration that would shatter normal steel. When fired, the round left the barrel at over 300-400 feet per second, too fast for the human eye to follow. At that velocity, armor no longer behaved like armor. Steel ceased to be a barrier and became a fluid deforming under stress. The tungsten penetrator did not smash through, it slipped through, parting the metal in microseconds. The surrounding armor superheated and vaporized around the path of impact, creating an instant channel of destruction. Inside the tank, fragments burst outward like shrapnel in a confined storm. The Germans had experimented with similar principles years earlier. Their 7.5 centimeter Pisa GR-40 used a tungsten core too, but it had been produced only in small numbers. Shortages of tungsten and the high cost of manufacturing made it impractical for sustained use. They had relied instead on their superior guns, the long-barreled 88s and 75s, to achieve penetration through sheer kinetic force. But as the war dragged on and materials waned, they lost the ability to refine those weapons further. The Americans, with their immense industrial base, could afford what Germany could not: Experimentation. The HVAP's sabot design was revolutionary. A lightweight outer casing allowed the smaller tungsten dart to travel down a standard 76 mm barrel without modification. As it exited the muzzle, the sabot split apart, freeing the core to continue at impossible speed. The principle was elegant, an arrow released from a sheath at the moment of flight. The results were measurable and terrifying. At 500 yards, the M93 could pierce 140 millimeters of armor at a 30-degree slope. At close range, even the frontal plate of a Tiger was vulnerable. But beyond the numbers lay the deeper impact, the end of the myth that armor thickness alone could guarantee survival. The HVAP was not a weapon of mass production. Even in 1945, only a fraction of American tanks carried more than a few rounds of it. But each one represented the arrival of a new age, an era when material science would decide battles as much as tactics. The tungsten dart was a glimpse into the future of warfare: precision, density, velocity, not weight. In the labs where the first rounds were tested, technicians spoke of energy concentration. The round delivered the same destructive power as a conventional shell, but on a point no wider than a fingertip. It was less an impact than a transfer of fury, a sudden conversion of speed into heat, metal into dust. German crews, of course, never saw the equations. They only saw the effect. A flash, a crack, and a hole too perfect to be believed. Armor plates peeled inward, edges glowing orange. To them, it seemed almost supernatural, a violation of the laws they had trusted their lives to. The ordnance reports described it clinically. Projectile, subcaliber, tungsten core, armor penetration exceeds expectations. But to those inside the tanks, it was something far simpler, a death that came too fast to see. The HVAP round would not win the war on its own. It was too rare, too costly, too late. Yet its significance was larger than the number of tanks it destroyed. It marked the moment when Allied engineering matched and in one critical area surpassed the mechanical genius of Germany. For the first time, American fire was not merely adequate, it was superior. And for the Germans, that revelation was more devastating than any explosion. The Germans tried to respond, but the response came too late, and it came from desperation rather than control. In the early months of 1945, engineers at MAN, Henschel, and Krupp convened under constant air raid alarms to discuss countermeasures. The data from the front was clear. The enemy had achieved velocities that rendered existing armor insufficient. They proposed new alloys, increased thickness, even radical sloping angles beyond 60 degrees. But none of it mattered. The Reich no longer had the steel, the tungsten, or the time. In some workshops, mechanics welded spare tracks across the lower glacis of Panthers and Tigers, hoping the extra layer might deflect the mysterious American rounds. Others filled sandbags or poured concrete into frontal compartments, makeshift measures born of fear. A few units experimented with reactive coatings and spaced armor, crude precursors of concepts that would reappear decades later. Nothing worked. The blue-tipped rounds cut through every improvisation. At the same time, German intelligence officers tried to trace the origin of the new threat. Reports from captured Allied supply depots mentioned special issue ammunition. Intercepted communications revealed references to HVAP. Analysts correctly translated it, high-velocity armor piercing. They understood its principle, but misjudged its scale. Many believed it was restricted to elite American units, perhaps only a handful of tanks per division. That assumption provided fragile comfort. It implied that the phenomenon was rare, exceptional, containable. But it wasn't rarity that mattered. It was fear. Even the possibility that any Sherman might fire one of those rounds forced German tank commanders to alter their tactics. They no longer risked frontal duels. They sought flanking positions, cover, ambushes, night engagements, methods they had once reserved for inferior opponents. In the frozen forests of the West, the hunters had become cautious. The hunted had become confident. Among the crews, the change was palpable. Panther commanders, once proud of their dominance, spoke quietly about new rules of survival. Do not expose the front plate unless certain of the first shot, one manual instructed. Never underestimate American velocity. Those words, written in the winter of 1945, marked a psychological surrender. In the American ranks, that shift was sensed but not understood. Crews noticed that German tanks no longer lingered in open ground. Panthers retreated faster, Tigers turned away sooner. Gunners like Donnelly, the same who had destroyed his first Panther months earlier, began to feel that the war itself had tilted slightly in their favor. For once, they were not just surviving, they were winning. Back in Germany, design offices pursued hopeless dreams. Blueprints circulated for the E-Series, a new generation of Entwicklung tanks, thicker, heavier, more invulnerable. But the plans were fantasies on paper. The factories that could have built them were already in ruins. Every day, Allied bombers erased another possibility. The Wehrmacht's technical bulletins acknowledged the new reality in their restrained language. The penetration capacity of enemy anti-armor munitions now exceeds the structural limits of standard panzer protection. Countermeasures not feasible with available resources. The tone was bureaucratic, but beneath it lay quiet despair. The myth of superiority had sustained the German tank corps through years of attrition. Now that myth was broken by mathematics and metallurgy. The war they had defined through precision and control was being rewritten by industrial improvisation. On the front lines, the consequences were immediate. Crews fought shorter engagements, retreated earlier, and abandoned disabled vehicles more often. Recovery units found tanks with clean holes through their armor, engines intact, crews gone. The investigators stopped counting the calibers. They already knew what had done it. It was the final irony of the war. The very weapon the Germans had once pioneered, the tungsten-cored penetrator, had returned to destroy them. And there was nothing left to counter it. The winter of 1944-45 was supposed to be Germany's last strike. The Ardennes offensive had been conceived as a thunderbolt, a final reversal that would fracture the Allied front and force negotiations. The plan depended on surprise, speed, and the unshakable confidence of German armor. In the first days, it seemed to work. American units were scattered, communications collapsed, snowstorms grounded Allied aircraft, Panthers and Tigers rolled through the forests like ghosts from a forgotten victory. But in the small villages and narrow valleys, something new awaited them. Sherman units, hastily regrouped and half-frozen, began to resist in unexpected ways. They fired from distances the Germans dismissed as useless, yet the shots landed true. Panthers burst into flames without warning. The first time it happened near Saint-Vith, a German crew insisted they had been hit by a concealed gun. It was only later that they realized it had been a frontal shot from a Sherman they had seen too late. In another sector, near Bastogne, the 4th Armored Division faced repeated German assaults. The Americans had only a few HVAP rounds per tank, but they saved them for the moments that counted. When the Panthers appeared through the mist, the gunners waited, steady hands on the triggers. The first volley ripped into the lead vehicles. 2 fireballs erupted in the snow, lighting the forest in amber flashes. The rest of the column halted, uncertain, their radios alive with disbelief. Reports filtered back to German command. Enemy tanks firing at abnormally high velocity. Multiple penetrations at long range. Armor failure without overmatch. The language grew clinical to hide the panic. But the effect was unmistakable. The offensive was slowing. Not from fuel shortages or weather, but from hesitation. For the first time, German tank crews began to fear open ground. They moved through forests and towns, seeking cover from eyes they could not see and guns they no longer trusted. Each duel that ended in a sudden, inexplicable loss chipped away at morale. The snow around the wrecks turned gray with soot and melted metal. American crews, exhausted and half-starved, began to sense a shift in the air. They were still outgunned, still out-armored, but not outmatched. The knowledge changed them. The once defensive Shermans began advancing deliberately into the kill zones that German doctrine had once dominated. Their commanders spoke quietly about the new ammunition, calling it a secret advantage. In truth, it was more psychological than logistical. Few tanks carried more than a handful of HVAP shells, but in the crucible of battle, belief was as powerful as steel. One German officer, writing after the war, described it bitterly. Our tanks were no longer the hunters. We became cautious, then reactive, then afraid. Every flash from an American gun felt fatal. By February, the pattern was clear. Across the Rhineland, Shermans were claiming victories once thought impossible. Gun duels that had once been suicide now ended in German wrecks smoldering beside the roads. The terrain of western Germany, villages, hedgerows, ruined towns, amplified the effect. At short ranges, even a few HVAP rounds could change the course of an engagement. In the archives of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, one report summarized the transformation succinctly. New ammunition has rendered the 76mm gun tactically decisive at previously unfavorable ranges. Behind those sterile words lay the truth of the battlefield, that American crews had finally found a weapon that allowed them to look their enemy in the eye and not flinch. For the Germans, it was a nightmare of inversion. The armored spearheads that had once driven Europe to its knees were now trapped in a shrinking ring of defeat. Their greatest strength, the illusion of technological invincibility, had turned to dust under the impact of a projectile no larger than a man's finger. The Ardennes offensive collapsed in the same snow it had begun. As the survivors retreated east, they carried with them a new word whispered with disbelief. Hochgeschwindigkeitsgeschoss, high-velocity shell. They had never expected the Sherman to fire this fast, and now it was too late to stop it. By March 1945, the sound of engines on the Western Front had changed. The thunder of massed panzer columns was gone, replaced by scattered echoes, isolated fights, hurried withdrawals, desperate rearguard actions. The once proud German armored divisions were hollow shells, worn down by attrition, starvation, and disbelief. They still fought, but no longer with the certainty of victory. In the ruins of small Rhineland towns, burned Panthers stood where they had tried to make their last stands. Many had single, precise holes in their frontal armor, too clean to be the result of artillery, too centered to be chance. Ordnance teams photographed them for study, noting the same signs over and over: molten edges, interior spalling, instant crew kills. To the American engineers, cataloging the wrecks, it was confirmation. To the Germans who stumbled upon them, it was humiliation. Captured diaries tell the same story in fragmented sentences. Armor useless. Cannot trust gun range. They fire faster than we can aim. The words repeat across divisions, across fronts, like a confession whispered too late. The psychological collapse of German armor did not come from defeat in battle. It came from the erosion of faith in the machines themselves. Panzer crews had once lived by an unspoken creed that engineering superiority would protect them. They believed that the thickness of steel could hold back the chaos of war. But when that shield failed, when the very concept of invulnerability was stripped away, something inside them broke. In one encounter near Remagen, a Panther platoon tried to ambush an American column crossing the river. The first Sherman was hit and burned, but the others returned fire instantly. Within seconds, 2 Panthers were destroyed. One exploded so violently that its turret landed 30 meters away. The survivors abandoned their vehicles, running through smoke and debris. A German sergeant captured later said simply, "They fired too quickly. We had no chance to think." For the Americans, the advance into Germany was relentless, almost mechanical. Tank crews no longer feared every open field. They moved with a quiet, methodical rhythm: halt, aim, fire, move. The battlefield that had once been a place of dread had become a place of grim competence. They didn't celebrate their new power, they used it. At night, when the engines cooled and the front fell silent, soldiers spoke about what it meant. They knew the war was ending. They knew that soon they would be driving through cities instead of forests. But beneath their exhaustion was something harder to name, a realization that they had outgrown the myth of German supremacy. The machine that had once terrorized them was now just another wreck on the roadside. German officers tried to rally what was left. They spoke of new designs, the Panther II, the E-50, the Jag Tiger, but the words felt hollow. None of those machines could undo the physics of defeat. The Allies had learned faster, produced faster, adapted faster. The war of machines had become a war of velocity, and the Germans could not keep up. By April, the remnants of panzer regiments were falling back toward the Elbe. Columns of tanks crawled through mud and ruin, engines coughing black smoke, tracks grinding over their own history. Many were destroyed not in combat, but by their own crews, abandoned, scuttled, burned to deny capture. The men who had once believed their armor could carry them across continents now walked eastward under the same gray skies that had once seemed full of promise. And in the villages behind them, American tanks rolled quietly forward. Some still carried a few HVAP rounds, their tips dulled from handling, their power largely unnecessary now. Yet each one represented the end of something. The last proof that in this war, even the most formidable could be overtaken by the relentless logic of progress. The German tank war, the myth of the invincible Panzer, had died not in fire, but in disbelief. When the war ended, the surviving tanks were silent monuments scattered across the ruined landscape of Europe. Fields once thundered with engines, and fire now lay still, littered with the husks of machines that had defined an era. The Allies catalogued the wrecks, the Germans buried their dead, and the world began to measure what had really happened in those final months. Among the mountains of reports and test data, a quiet truth emerged. Victory had not come from size, nor from myth, but from adaptation. The Americans had not built a better tank, they had built a faster answer. In the tungsten core of the HVAP round lay the symbol of that shift: intelligence over intimidation, innovation over illusion. It was the weapon that had ended the illusion of German invulnerability. In post-war trials, engineers examined the wrecks of Panthers and Tigers with scientific detachment. They measured the holes left by M93 rounds, photographed the melted steel, recorded the velocities. Many of them spoke with awe about what they saw. Speed alone can defeat mass, one report concluded. It was a statement that reached far beyond the battlefield. It was the new law of the mechanical age. For the Germans who survived, the realization was bitter. Their faith in armor, in the perfection of design, had been their pride. But perfection had betrayed them. The same precision that once gave them superiority had become rigidity, an inability to adapt. The Americans, with their crude, mass-produced Shermans, had found strength in flexibility. When the old equations no longer worked, they wrote new ones. In the years that followed, the lessons of 1944 and 1945 shaped everything that came after. Tank design around the world shifted toward velocity, smaller caliber high-energy guns, and advanced ammunition. The HVAP was the forerunner of a revolution, the ancestor of the kinetic penetrators that would define Cold War armor doctrine. The future of warfare belonged not to the thickest armor, but to the fastest idea. Yet beyond the laboratories and manuals, there remained the human memory of what it felt like. German veterans would later recall the shock of seeing their trusted machines destroyed by enemies they had once dismissed. American crews would remember the disbelief of finally surviving a duel they were supposed to lose. In both memories, there was a shared understanding that in those final battles, something fundamental had changed. The Sherman, once mocked and maligned, had not simply grown stronger. It had evolved quietly, invisibly, into something its creators had never imagined, a symbol of learning under fire. When the tungsten round left its barrel at 3,000 feet per second, it carried more than metal. It carried the accumulated desperation of a nation that refused to remain predictable. On a spring morning in 1945, near Kassel, an American ordnance officer walked among rows of wrecked German armor. He stopped beside a Panther, its frontal plate pierced clean through. Inside, the air smelled of oil and rust. On the edge of the hole, the steel had turned blue from heat. He ran his hand over the smooth edge and wrote in his notebook, 1 round, direct hit, entry, frontal, exit, rear. Dead. That line became just another entry in an endless archive, but in its simplicity lay the story of the entire war's final chapter. The Germans had believed that speed belonged to them, that precision and strength would always keep them one step ahead. They were wrong. In the end, it was the unassuming Sherman, the tank they had called obsolete, that delivered the lesson no armor could withstand. They never expected it to fire this fast, and by the time they learned, the age of the invincible tank was already over.